this is a catalyst for research, right? We should look at that.
Yeah,
So, I mean, for me, I think your point on values is absolutely well made. Because I did a lot of research in the value space. One of the most interesting things for me was the Engelhardt kind of world values survey, where they look at values across different countries every 5 years or so, and they do this rolling sort of longitudinal research. They were finding trends in how the values of a particular society, nation, for example, will change depending on things like the economic state. So when people are flush, everybody's rich, you got a lot of money, you can afford to be more liberal. And as the economic situation tightens and jobs are lost and people have less money and cost of living is higher, then you tend towards conservatism. And that's rooted in social psychology, where you have this in-group, out-group kind of psychology, where you say, when resources are scarce, I will protect my resources from people who are outside my group. So you have this group level social psychology. And those kinds of findings also chime with the kind of Schwartz and Rockich kind of view of values, where we're saying that values are something that can be measured, that can be to some degree predicted, and we can do that quantitatively, and every culture is different based on one or more axes where we can measure them. So individualism versus collectivism is the Hofstadter paradigm of culture, which relates to individual level values. So we have these kind of researchers doing this kind of thing. And when we think about value systems and AI, we're really thinking about, well, how does one particular society solve their problems compared to another particular society? And that reflects in their values, which reflects in their culture, which reflects in their sort of norms, their buildings, their totems, their idols, their religions, all of the things that we attribute as artifacts of culture, as reflections of value systems. And the reason I mentioned a World Value Survey is they benchmark that every 5 years. Now, which obviously means if you were to benchmark today, you would have missed a seismic shift in our environment, which is the AI revolution, the thing that we're calling the AI revolution. So do value systems shift and keep up with that kind of disruption that quickly? Because people generally don't change quickly. So we have a very big difference in the speed of change when it comes to societal change and when it comes to technological change. And I don't think it's going to be easy to cope with at this speed, because things like, if I just reference a handful of things, I've been at a few events over the last few weeks, and I've been exposed to people and their ideas. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, we'll see, we'll find out. But having this kind of stimulus is always helpful. I was at one event where they were talking about men's feelings, so how emotionally expressive men are, whether or not they're capable of having the vocabulary and language to discuss their feelings as openly as women do, whether it's even important. Some of these questions were coming around. And on the other side, the topic of the AI girlfriend, we do have male loneliness is starting to be recognized as a thing as well. And, there are areas of the population where men do have a lack of social contact. So is this one way of thinking about that, how to resolve that problem? So we've got all of these things in the mix. And on the other side, we have the ability of the system, the conversational system itself, to replicate something that could be perceived as human conversation, whether it's text or whether it's voice. But the layer on top of that, which you just described, was, could it be perceived as emotionally intelligent? And to some degree, I want to dissect that a little bit, because you could have a conversational text, a paragraph of prose, or a voice that has all the attributes of emotion that a human being would perceive as being emotionally intelligent, without there actually being emotional intelligence behind that. So it has the attributes. It's a facsimile of the thing without being the thing itself. And to some degree, if we could do that, then how helpful is that? Or is it something we need to cope with as a society?
Yeah, and what are the implications for the mass production of that as well? I think let's again look backwards in order to look forwards. Again, mid 19th century, 1940s, Industrial Revolution. We have a case of values not keeping up with technology. Prior to Industrial Revolution, people generally live in small communities. There's not a mass society is a temporary phenomenon that happens for political events, for wars. It's not like people live in mass formations most of the time. In that context, some things like, I don't know, child labor, they seem pretty normalized, pretty tame, just really children learning from their parents, how to do their jobs and adding some value along the way. Nothing wrong with that. When we get into a truly mass society where the working class are created from the countryside and live regimented lives inside industrial systems, we see that the effects of child labor are ruinous in terms of the health and safety implications, the food supply, the ability of communities to sort of regulate their involvement in that system is not great, and it takes many decades and many disasters, such as disaster that happened near where I am now at the National Coal Mining Museum, the site underneath that in West Yorkshire, where there's these devastating events that happen, like a mine shaft collapses. There's no there's a flood. There's not really the right safety provisions. Dozens of children die at the same time trying to escape from a mine. And after this, news of this, reaches London, and Queen Victoria kind of intervenes and bans child labour in the women and children. And a system that had been based on families mining together kind of collapses under the weight of the fact that technology is just different here. Like with industrial technology. That requires large teams of people working together. We have to change our values. We need to take measures to protect children from involvement in the system until they're big enough and strong enough and smart enough, to survive it. That now we think about emotions and emotional intelligence and the idea of the mass produced emotion, or simulation of emotional intelligence or emotional capability. I don't know that our values are ready yet for the change that has happened. So if you think of, you use this example, there was a taboo around meeting people online. Or it was like a taboo, maybe it was seen as unusual, then it became mainstream. And now it is the main way of meeting people. And that we now encounter the problem of, I would say, so this is known in systems theory, such as Lerman's system theory, as autopoiesis, right? Self-creation. In that any sufficiently well-designed system, including all of its economic inputs and outputs, will tend towards self-recreation or autopoiesis. Now, the stock in trade of that autopoiesis, that stability, that homeostatic stability, is for digital systems is some form of engagement and payment, ultimately payment to keep using the system. And the way to achieve that is to produce behaviors that are fairly addictive. Some are quite benign, someone playing Baldur's Gate all night. We can't really say that's a serious problem. That's an activity any adult can choose to do, like they can choose any other activity, right? So I guess that kind of gaming's off the hook. But some other activities, such as using dating apps, it could be seen as much more problematic, because it's like, what is the stock in trade of this? Is this a simulation of romance? Is this a simulation of meeting people, which is reducing your ability to do the real thing, which is increasing the level of unhappiness? And do we need to catch up with that? Do we need some more social norms that mean that there's maybe, I don't think bringing a taboo back on meeting people online makes any sense, because of course there is no distinction now between online and offline. We're always online. We're always leaving digital signals. We're always connected to the network. It makes sense. We connect with someone, we immediately tap their name into a system that's connected over the internet that syncs up with all of our profiles and creates a digital link between us that's going to be traceable forever, right? So it's not like we're not online. Meeting people offline is in fact really possible. We can just meet them in person at the same time as meeting them online now, as opposed to only meeting them in person in the past, or maybe only meeting someone online, which is the only real alternative to that. But do we need some kind of way of understanding? Do we need a better understanding, again, to come back to the other point of where the real value comes from in that interaction? And do we need to be careful, like we are a bit more careful of alcohol and cigarettes and increasingly now of junk food, about the overall quality? Do we need, for example, to see dating apps as a use to achieve something and then move on, but not as an end in themselves? I think the broader question, though, then, if you're going to say that, is that problem that you mentioned of if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, is it a duck? That's a question I can't answer. I can't answer if the AI relationship you might form with someone, whether that's a customer service agent or whether that's a romantic partner or whether that's a manager or whether that's an employee, This is a trope, isn't it, on social media? If you all my AI employees, I've got this agent doing this, agent doing this, agent doing this. I love to see how quickly one of those systems actually fell apart in the absence of any kind of regulating mechanism, right, to check the outputs against each other and so on. But I think that question is a really real one that we should maybe grapple with a bit, which is, if you get the right outputs from the system, do you care whether it's a human on the other end or not? Ultimately, and this is a Jungian concept of the imago and the persona. Ultimately, we only ever encounter projections of ourselves and other people, and sometimes when they react in unpredictable ways, we experience a jarring effect, which is the theme of a lot of Gothic, fiction from the 19th century. That jarring, that kind of, what? Hang on a minute, this avatar isn't behaving in a way I expected it to. Something is wrong here. But generally, if we're happy with the outputs, we just accept that the other actor is kind of human enough. And again, we can scale that technology now. We can scale that interaction now beyond just receiving a right answer to an email or a right SMS message in response, or a right letter in a post back, or some other kind of like virtual surreal, virtual interaction. But are we able to cope with the consequences of that happening at scale, en masse, of people being happy not to talk to other people because they can talk to these much more polished AI versions of people?
Well, just to bounce that straight back to you, does it matter if people are in solitude talking to AI agents and not talking to each other? There is obviously an impact on the continuity of the species at some point, but for lots of the population, let's think about normal distribution again. We have population dynamics, and there's going to be some kind of distribution. So we have probably a lot of people on one side of the curve who are happy not to engage. Maybe it would be problematic if they did engage. There is a solution there. People on the other end who don't want to engage with machines, they want to engage with people, and they're happy to engage with each other. And then we have a kind of continuum in the middle where we say the bulk of the population probably is, where you have some engagement with people and some engagement with AI agents. That, to me, broadly doesn't seem that problematic at that level. When we consider the possibilities, we have, AI babysitters for children, virtual tutors all the way through to pastoral care. We have AI for the elderly, helping out in care homes and managing their loneliness. We have cross-cultural and cross-language AI facilitating conversations between people all around the world. Ordered some headphones, not these ones, in case anybody was wondering. They haven't arrived yet. But the headphones that I've just ordered, they claim to have translation capability in them. So I wanted to test that out. As I travel the world, somebody talks to me in one language and I hear them in English. That sounds amazing. That sounds like almost dystopian, that I could go around the world and do that. So we have all of these attributes where we say we could be facilitating contact, we could be facilitating emotive response, we could be satisfying some kind of need that we have as people to engage. But at the same time, it's a machine. Is it a problem if the machine doesn't love us back? Because sometimes you engage with people and there is a kind of facade of emotion and they don't really care, right? So sometimes people fake it. How much does it matter?
Well, yeah, I think this is an interesting philosophical question, isn't it? Because I think in analytic philosophy, people would study the zombie problem, right? It's a major philosophical problem. If it looks like a duck, bites like a duck, is it a duck? And obviously AI brings that vividly to life in so many ways. In fact, that we're all becoming more and more adept at looking for the cracks to try to understand if what we're talking to is an AI agent or a person. I think when it comes to that question of is it okay? Do we really mind? I think the answer is that we don't yet know exactly what gets unlocked by that change. So, but we have examples that we can draw upon. And by the change, I mean the change into systems that are genuinely emotional, because I think we're right to focus in on that. But that's definitely the cutting edge, and that's what's going to happen next. If people are wondering what's going to happen next, I think systems that can feign emotional intelligence and give emotional responses and receive emotional inputs are coming. And will be transformational. And this should be, as disconcerting as it sounds, it's also as interesting because it'll be yet another capability that we have assumed is human, but it's not apparently completely human. Of course, animals also show emotion, even very simple ones, so it's easy to forget that. So let's look back to previous waves of technology that have also disrupted things and see how that affected us. So if we look at, to reference again this French philosopher Bernard Stiegler, he talks about three waves of automation. He talks about in the 19th century, there was the automation of gesture. So whereas just kind of movements that were previously done in as handicrafts, as home-based industries became to manufacture fabrics, for example, started happening as industrial processes, power looms, and things became automated. Work knowledge was turned into machines rather than people being in people's heads. It was externalized. And then in the 20th century, there's another level of automation in which it's possible to have mass-produced sort of virtual experiences of life in the form of television and radio, television more profoundly, and cinema. And Stiegler more ambitiously says, well, this kind of automates life knowledge. We learn about life from, or removes life knowledge from the equation. We learn about life from experiences on television. And maybe the fact that we started making home videos and sharing our memories through that also. And now that practice is all pervasive. Now all memory is mediated through photos and videos. It's so easy to make. Steeler predicts in the 21st century that we're going to see an automation of theoretical knowledge itself, i.e. abstract ideas that were the domain of human expertise will now be externalized in machines that we consult before we try and do the real thing. And he gives the example of the Google engineers who developed the Chinese instance of Google Translate without speaking Chinese themselves. They were able to use big data in order to do that. So now I think that there's one important caveat in that these are three big statements, and there's always like a bleed. There's always a gap between that statement and reality. So yeah, we did automate gesture. We did have heavy industry, and we did have the Industrial Revolution. But it still takes a great degree of skill to put a production line together. It still takes a great degree of human knowledge and insight to actually automate something like that. So there's still a big room for what the human can do there. But nevertheless, the impact of that was that we would probably see as positive now. There's no country in the world that doesn't aspire to greater levels of industrialization if they're not there yet, because they know that it leads to an increasing living standards overall, with enough food for people to eat and enough commodities for them to buy. Similarly, no one could really argue that the widespread availability of televisual media and media transmission is a problem. It's something that really connects us and is useful. But I think the question that you're happening upon is, do we know what happens when kind of ideas themselves are the first run can happen through AI? When AI kind of has some kind of say about what we all think before we say it. There's likely to be some downstream benefits from that, as we already see with translation. Like we can all speak more languages, and we can all learn languages more quickly. What does that mean for the understanding that we get from actually learning how to speak another language? Clearly there's some huge benefits, but there's going to be a loss there, isn't there? And I guess that would be, to come back around, that question of the machine can feign emotional intelligence, but the people that designed it have none. Is that good? Is that positive? Like the machine that can speak Chinese, but the people who built it can't speak Chinese. The knowledge has been subtracted from that situation. And therefore, what kind of emotional intelligence? Or does it just put even more of a premium on emotions? I would like to think that one positive output from all of this stuff will be that we have less of a focus on STEM subjects and more of a focus on holistic, rounded education in the education system. And we try to really focus, as we're starting to do, on emotional intelligence and on feelings and on fuzzier ideas about stuff, as opposed to this relentless focus on maths and science, because ultimately AI is going to be able to help with those processes a lot. And it isn't going to be, at the moment, schools are really focused on teaching maths, to the exclusion of many other subjects. I've heard maths teachers really complain about this. And there was a point about 4 or 5 years ago in which the pass rate dropped as low as 25, 30% for some maths exams. And it became a real thing to bludgeon people with. And that was really problematic. Whereas some skills, like teaching people how to practice relaxing or to have emotions, to practice those things well, very easy to teach and should be taught more widely. Maybe that's what we learn. Maybe we need to see the mass simulation of emotions and recoil a bit in horror as to what that means. And then we can come back to understanding the value of it. I'm aware I didn't answer your question of, is this just okay, though, for people to mistake the machine for the real thing and to confuse that? Maybe I just don't want to answer that question. Maybe you should answer it for yourself.
Fair enough. Well, the thing that you're touching on, though, is I'm possibly going to take this to a weird place because you're making me think about this. For the last few weeks, I've been part of a number of women's groups where we're talking about supporting our sisters and friends and colleagues who are in our professions and making sure they have equality of opportunity. The thing that makes me that you're making me think about is we used to have a situation where we would say women are emotionally intelligent, men are in STEM, and STEM professions make more money. So we need to level the playing field and provide opportunities for women in STEM. And there were groups formed to try and promote this. And now we're coming full circle to saying, we've gone so far in STEM that we've automated pretty much all the things we were going to do, and AI is now there. And what we need to focus on the emotional intelligence stuff. So, you know what, ladies? You stay in STEM, and all the guys are going to shift over this way because that's where the money's going to be.
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
So,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? There's a kind of a cycle of hypocrisy there, which I'm sure somebody somewhere would pick up on. And eventually where we need to go is sort of equality and equity of opportunity for everybody around the things that we do in society. And that's the point that we kind of eventually want to go down. But that's what you were making me think of when I was thinking about this, when you were talking.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I want to, because I think we're at risk of not emphasizing this enough, especially my last comment about STEM stuff, being susceptible to support by AI in ways that mean it's less necessary to teach it. I do strongly believe that we need to spend less time teaching science and maths in schools with the limited time we have and focus more on physical, mental, and emotional education, because I do believe that we live in a world in which those skills are more necessary than ever to cope with the hostile environment, for the human body that we've inadvertently created. So I do believe that. But what I don't want to foster is the delusion that the AI-enabled future won't require expertise, but it won't require skilled human operators to organize, to orchestrate, to leverage these systems, and to gain advantage from them. I want to bring to mind a world in which very few people can print material and increasingly many people can either read it or simply have it read out to them. This is the period of what's known in Europe as the wars of religion, in which, over hundreds of years, conflicts blossomed across Europe, upended society and devastated people. And the fuel for that fire was printing, and it was beneficial in some ways, but we had a pretty difficult situation in which there was this mass proliferation of knowledge. The attitudes to that knowledge were still the same medieval attitudes, and it created this kind of religious ferment, which was really destructive. And we see modern examples of this happening all the time. Facebook has obviously been involved in some of those blossomings of violence because of information circulating, right? Then eventually, by the time we get to the 20th century, we move to a very different world in which people can read and write. They are producers as well as consumers. And this is a lot better now, because now people can participate. Now people can easily publish their own articles and journals and magazines, and they can act, and things can bubble up and proliferate. And I think we're going to find the same issue with AI. And to try to answer that question, what do I like about the idea of, I don't know why we keep coming back to this idea of an AI partner, AI girlfriend, as we're unhelpfully calling it. Could be an AI boyfriend, when lots of people are lonely, of all genders, of all gender designations, and none indeed. But what I don't like so much is a subscription service run by some central authority, even more administered, by the NHS at all. I mean, sure, if it was run by the NHS, it'd be pretty common denominator. It probably wouldn't be that good. But do I like the idea of someone with a toolkit to build an AI agent that reflected their personality, that they could have as a companion, much in the same way we might choose to write a diary, or in the same way we might choose to create art? Yeah, I like that. And I think that is where the real future of AI is going. And at recent events, we've tried to introduce this catchphrase, right, of a local language model, but not a local language model, but simply installed on a local device. Although in practice, that would also be the case, right? You would either through some form of virtualization and hosting, or just physically install it on a device. But the idea might be that you have a language model which is local to a community or to a community of practice, just like companies are doing with their own enterprise instances of these models, which can be, and we're not quite there with the technology yet, but we're getting there now quite rapidly, can be retrained, on local knowledge. I can learn from local knowledge, can process that, and can act as a community resource and a font of information that people can gain the kind of, trans individual intersubjective benefits that we get from all knowledge. How do we do this? How do I do this? Who's good on this? Who's the expert on this? How can we work together on this? What can be improved? What policy proposals should we have? What guidelines should we have? How do I understand this complex issue? How much more powerful was that to understand an issue such as, should we build a wind turbine here? Should we allow this company to build a factory here? What time should the trains run? Like what kind of, we kind of introduce traffic calming measures in this road? When should schools open? When should they close? I feel like if it was in the hands of local communities limited to a certain size, I feel like AI technology could be so powerful simply because it's so much smarter than humans at making those kind of calls and those kind of decisions. Humans just can't consult the level of literature that an AI can consult about a given topic. But somehow, whenever we try to take this and scale it globally, we don't really like the results. There's something creepy about it. There's something that's not right. So I think this idea of a local language model with local expertise and indeed local experts who are like, the guardians of that technology is certainly something that could go some way to delivering more of the upsides and less of the downsides, because the theme has been throughout, right? It's like technology very powerful, centralization of that technology. We need to be careful with that.
But that's a control attribute, right? Because we're not, as a society, we're not comfortable with the idea that something could go wrong and nobody is to blame. And this is one of the things around autonomous vehicles, right? We can probably have autonomous vehicles on the road now, but we're not ready to accept them. And the same is probably true of a number of different other AI technologies that we could deploy at scale and potentially fix some problems, but we need to be ready as a society. We need to be comfortable in our regulatory environment. And importantly, everybody needs to be on board with it. You can't do it to people. They need to be somehow sanctioning or endorsing the fact that it's there. And that also brings its own problems because people have varying levels of knowledge and skill and trust and, prior experience and even their perceptions of, the robots taking over the world. I think I've had 3 conversations this year with people who've said to me, but what about like Skynet? Are we gonna have that kind of mass taking over of the planet? Everybody's got a different level of knowledge about this. And how do you bring everybody along on this kind of journey when we also have this attribute of people are in their own echo chambers on social media? They're getting pushed different agendas. They're sometimes unable to discriminate between what's real and what isn't when they see it on the newsfeed. So you've got all of this stuff happening at the same time as you've got the hype cycle and the trough of disillusionment going on, where now people are somehow starting to doubt what's out there. So you've got these multiple competing models, which are resulting in quite a messy conversation. How do you sort of corral some of that stuff to try and figure out, well, fine, this is the direction of travel. This is where we're going to go.
I love the idea of it being a really messy conversation. And it makes me think of when you read a history book, they'll talk about how there was a debate about something. So like if we're looking again, this early technology example at the time of Socrates, there's a debate about whether the Greeks should allow writing to supplant oral transmission of information as the organizing principle of their society. But of course, it wasn't really a debate, was it? Because the people involved had fundamentally different motivations and value systems, and they would have not seen writing as we see it now at all as a kind of neutral tool. They would have seen numbers as potentially magic and indistinguishable from sorcery and religion and magic. They just wouldn't. It would have been very messy as well. And I think it's good to acknowledge that we are in a messy space now. And if people are worried about, I'm sorry, but if you live in any number of conflict zones around the world, that's already there. Skynet's already here. Like you are already being targeted by AI controlled weaponry. So I don't think that it's not the person who believes that the risk is Skynet is simply the person who doesn't feel immediately under threat from some kind of automated targeting system. For someone who does, the question is more about how do we stop this from happening, right? So I think the more pertinent question than will the robots kind of take over is to acknowledge that the robots are already in the building. How do we try to mitigate the worst effects of that and to survive that? So I agree that that's why even trying to come up with clarifying levers and questions about, who, for example, at what level does someone have the say for a particular use case or not? And how do we avoid that becoming something which is just rooted in interests that are just nothing to do with the output of that? Is it the same thing to say that someone should have a job as a teacher or a teaching assistant, and to say that this technology produces a good outcome or not? For example, I don't know what you think about this topic, but we know probably that engaging with a conversational interface is better for learning than clicking buttons on an iPad and playing a game on an iPad, right? Now, schools rush to incorporate iPads and different forms of tablet devices. Bit of a retreat back from that, but there's still like a lot of devices in schools aren't necessarily that conducive to the kind of learning we want. But it's probably the case that engaging with conversational AI interfaces could be very, very helpful for school children in a whole number of ways. And arguably, it's a skill they just need to master in a way you really don't with an iPad. That's the whole point. It's really easy to use. It's not really like a difficult thing to engage with. Whereas conversational AI, prompting AI, is not necessarily easier than just not doing it, but it does produce much higher quality outputs, right? And so that's a very different equation to like, it's just easy to do something on an app, so therefore let's do that. So I think that we probably need to be thinking about whether we like who is what are the real interests of people engaging in this conversation, and how do we disentangle those and look at the value that we're trying to produce. And I kind of feel like this should be quite easy, because if we do live in societies where there are huge social problems, so we mentioned the problem of loneliness, that's a big one. Enemy, isolation, that's a big one. Unfortunately, hunger is still a problem across the world, including in Western societies, including in the UK. Housing is still a problem. Access to opportunities is still a problem. The same problems are still here. It shouldn't be that hard to try to disentangle fears about individuals losing particular jobs from a question of society overall, because I do feel like there's enough work to do. I don't feel like that generally theorists of technology have foreseen a collapse of jobs. Just wide scale unemployment has been the thing predicted again and again and again and again and again and again. It just doesn't happen in the way that people think it's going to happen, because I just don't think the technology removes the need for human labor. I think it just changes the role of the human in very automated systems. It changes the role of the human appendage. Like, I think that there's always going to be some kind of job involved in serving systems that are largely automated. For example, humans are involved in AI data annotation, right? Or data annotation to train models in a large scale way now. That's like a big industry of people that go in and tag stuff. So I'm not sure that focusing just on unemployment as the risk here and trying to avoid that by any means is the right way to focus on this, what we do and who gets to decide question.
On that, you're talking about Mechanical Turk, right?
Yeah, and there's a few companies that exist to train models. So if people need a model trained on particular types of image data, and that image data needs to be wrested from the mass of the internet and annotated correctly, therefore any custom built model for one of these, AI avatar companies will require a data set to be trained by a human. And so there's a new industry of work for humans to basically say, yes, this is that, this is not that.
Interesting. I'm doing a project at the moment. Maybe you can WhatsApp me some details.
I will.
But where were you going with the iPad thing? So when you were talking about like the rush to adopt iPads versus the rush to adopt ChatGPT in schools for ChatGPT or Claude or Copilot or whatever flavor you want in terms of conversational agent, the thing that I was thinking was that if you are a school or some other educational establishment or a business or something, there was always with iPads, because it was an expensive piece of shiny equipment that looked slick and whatever, there was always a luxury commodity attachment to this. So there's a perception that if we say we've put iPads into schools, the brand elevation of that school is apparent. You can say that this is a technology capable school. And everything you mentioned around automation in the past, there was a financial barrier to entry. So this was an investment. It was expensive stuff that was being put in. We have a very different situation now, because what we have is democratization. Everything is kind of free. The barrier to entry is pretty low. If you do have to pay a little bit of money, it's a little bit of money, mostly affordable to most folks around the world. Different geographies, of course, have different economic conditions, so I won't speak for everybody. That means it no longer has the luxury tag. So the things around conspicuous consumption and behaviors around consumption are slightly different. And that means that it's no longer the badge of honor to say, we are using this in our school. Please send us all of your students. So I think there is a difference in previous automations to this, previous automation revolutions to this one, because the price point is different. So the luxury perception is different. And it's, to some degree, it's a hygiene mechanism that, in the past you could say, well, this particular industry is automating, but the rest aren't. This is a pan industry disruption. So the factors I feel are different.
Yeah, it's true. And I think there's a growing understanding of technology and using it in a purposeful way. I think that is beginning to change. As ever, it manifests in social mores, initially. So you will see now fashions emerging in parenting whereby screen time is limited, is treated more like a luxury commodity because it's no longer seen as people. We understand there are potential harms to be done just by dumping your kids in front of a screen all the time, as opposed to maybe limiting access to that. So we're more conscious now of the risks of technology and less likely to just embrace it for the sake of it being a fad. And it's a good point, like that really ushered in an era of mobile computing. The fact that iPads were a aspirational item. In fact, it was almost like running the 21st century in a 20th century playbook of technology, right? Which is like, like make something glamorous. Early radios are really big, really expensive.
Yeah.
They were called crystalline sets. Very deliberately, right? Like it was like a luxury item, and then that led them to proliferate. And it's really interesting what you say about AI, because AI is so fascinating as a technology. Is much more. It's not an object. It insinuates itself into other technologies, other objects. It's everywhere. We've had build this example of predictive text for a while. It pops up all over our devices, and it once deployed, once a model is trained, it can be run on cheap kind of servers. It's so ubiquitous, it's so cheap, and for the kind of use cases we could use it for in education, it's basically free. You know what I mean? Like the answers that I might need to get AI for like a term paper or something like that, something to do at school, I can get. They're built into browsers, right? If you have the Brave
Yep.
browser, they've got their own language model. They run it ultra cheap, ultra lean, and so you get AI answers to any query. You don't have to pay a penny for it, and it's everywhere. So I think that we can, again, I think we look at a system like education and we see a problem in terms of contact time with students. We see an issue where there could be interpersonal interactions, there isn't enough of that happening because there's just too many students and not enough teachers, and the profession is not seen as an attractive destination. And teachers complain about the admin overhead. They complain about having to prepare the classes. They complain about, having to do all this stuff, do all this training, do all this kind of reporting. They complain about behavior. There does seem to be an opportunity to, if you were to try to redesign the system from the ground up, to really build the use of AI and the competent use of, and careful use of AI into every aspect of the educational system, to find all the free tools, to spread them, to make sure that every student is coming into every conversation with the advantage of something that's written in perfect English that draws upon a fairly decent, array of human knowledge for that particular problem they're working on, and then just see what happens. And
Yeah.
it's a bit like we can strip out a lot of the stuff that traditionally has held students back for no obvious reason other than economic inequality, not having the right equipment, not having the right internet connection, not having the right access. People have done work, haven't they, to try to put the internet in boxes that can be put locally down in local communities. Well, let's say a student doesn't have access to the internet at home. They don't need access to the internet. We just give them a local device that has a language model built in that has enough knowledge for them to do their homework from it. The possibilities are just
Yeah.
huge. And then if you think the barriers to that, like teachers worried about their professions, worried about cheating. I mean, come on, like cheating is just surely going to be like, at first it was cheating, right? Like, and now, in an academic sense, I've certainly had to deal with this idea of you wouldn't call it plagiarism, just like a low quality level of like research, like grabbing something from the internet, lifting
Yeah.
it and putting it into an article. I mean, the Gen AI change has revealed to us what people in the Middle Ages knew very well. There isn't an original source for any knowledge. There is no author you can really attribute an idea to. Plagiarism is just not a thing that should be accepted. What matters is the quality of the output. Does it achieve the job that it needs to do? And so I think there's going to be big battles in the education system, but I think that it certainly, I really do believe at those lower levels of education we should be trying to kind of soak people in the capability of AI, because it offers the potential to bring people up to being at a level playing field more quickly, and that will be more disruptive and more interesting for existing social and class hierarchies, and almost regardless of the consequences of that. Like, I want the students to be as smart as the teachers. And if the teachers don't like that, then they're not really in the right profession, because education should be an exchange. It shouldn't be someone talking from a podium.
Well, the other part of that is that for me, we think about a student needs to write an essay, right? Or you need to write a thesis, or, which is something we've both done. What's the point in that? Because the point of a student writing an essay is to demonstrate that the student has the ability to critically think their way through the literature and to put their thoughts down in a coherent and structured way that somebody else can read it. And we got to some degree, we got to question, is that a skill we actually need as an outcome? Because if we don't need that skill, because we in the future will be able to do this at great scale and facility with artificial intelligence, then the only thing that's left is to say, well, we don't need that skill, so we were just using it as a mechanism of assessment. And if that's all we were doing, is there a better way to assess? And you could argue that AI affords us that better way of assessment through this back and forth, this questioning, Socratic questioning and vocalization and voice agents and all of these things, gives us the capability. So are we using outmoded methods of assessment?
Yeah. Obviously, the answer is yes. We are using outmoded methods of assessment. That is that's beyond dispute. Now, I think where those methods have a lot of value is they do force students to learn how to concentrate on things that are boring. To put in effort to repetitive processes that are boring. And they teach people this idea of focus and concentration, and to marshal their emotions. Now, but are there ways to do that without having? I mean, look, the horse has already bolted, so the debate about whether these methods are irrelevant is already obsolete, in that they already are. And trying to hold back the cheating is like trying to hold back a flood. It won't work. So I think we have to accept that we're going to need new methods of assessment and awards, and probably also accept the reality, which is we're going to have this really weird period, anachronistic period, in which day-to-day practice is enabled by very advanced technology, and everywhere people are getting really interesting, cool work done using advanced technology. But the gateways to those jobs will be through systems as antiquated as rote learning Latin grammar or Greek grammar to get a job in the British civil service in the in the early 20th century. Like, that's the reality. And so I think it's a good time to be aware of that. It is a bad time to be involved in one of those legacy places and resisting this change, because you're not going to gain more ability to criticize and to contest and control the flow of new technology unless you're willing to understand it, and understanding it will afford you the right to shape its direction. But just refusing to engage will just guarantee that you're the person walking around in a three-piece suit and a top hat. Like, you're not gonna win any traction that way.
I love it. I've seen people in top hats recently, so it's
Maybe it's coming back.
anyway.
Maybe I should get a top hat. Yeah.
Maybe on that bombshell. So the keys to the kingdom are in your adaptability to leverage technology for the things that you need and want in your future careers. Whether or not we resolve some of these things during this debate, I think we've had a fantastic conversation. And of course, thank you, Dr. Toby Harris, for this conversation, one of many. Of course. If you are watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe. If you're watching this on Spotify, follow the channel. Many more of these kinds of things to come. See you next time.
See ya. Thank you.